In October 2011, 16 US Marines stopped walking because of a voice they couldn't see, couldn't trace, and hadn't been told to trust. One more step would have killed the first 3 men in the column. They only understood later that the man who stopped them had been lying in the ground 20 meters away the entire time, watching them walk straight towards something they never had a chance of seeing. The district was Na Zad, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. A tight sprawl of mud compounds, irrigation cuts, and dry farmland stretching toward a narrow river line. The ground there had a reputation, not for firefights, but for memory. Every path had been walked, watched, and eventually turned into a weapon. The dust was pale, almost grey, clinging to sweat, filling rifles, settling into eyes and lungs until it stopped feeling foreign and started feeling permanent. By the end of the first week, nobody tried to keep it out. You didn't stay clean in Na Zad, you adapted, or you slowed down. Staff Sergeant Daniel Kowalski was on his 3rd deployment. 31 from Milwaukee, quiet in the way men become after enough time in the same environment. His father had spent years on a factory line, and Kowalski carried that same steady rhythm into everything he did. He wore a small metal medallion under his armor, a habit he never questioned and never changed. By the time he reached Afghanistan again, he had stopped expecting deployments to feel different. New ground, same rules. Only the details shifted. The British had held Na Zad before them. The handover was clean, efficient, exactly what you expected. But there was something in the way the British troops spoke during the briefings. Not fear, not even exhaustion. Something quieter, like men stepping away from a problem that hadn't been solved, only passed on. One of them said, almost casually, "Watch the northern fields." He didn't explain. Nobody asked. Within 10 days, things started to change in ways that didn't show up in reports. Movement patterns shifted. Routes that should have been active went silent. Areas that had produced contact suddenly didn't. No air support had hit that sector. No large patrols had moved through it recently. And yet something had altered the behavior of everyone using that ground. The Marines didn't have a name for it, so they made one. They called it the Ghosts. Corporal Ray Tanner was the first to say what others were thinking. British SAS, he said one evening, leaning in a doorway like it was obvious. 2-man teams, no vehicles, no backup. They go out, disappear, and come back when they're done. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody denied it either. The idea stayed because it made sense of something they couldn't otherwise explain. Control without presence, influence without visibility. The heat still held the district even in October. By midday, it pressed down hard enough to slow thought as much as movement. Before sunrise, though, there was a brief window where the air felt almost thin, like the place hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. That was when Kowalski moved his platoon. On the morning of the 18th, they stepped off before first light. Task: clear a series of compounds flagged for explosive storage. Routine in structure, unpredictable in execution. Engineers had swept the route twice in the previous 48 hours. Cleared meant nothing had been found yet. It didn't mean safe. They moved in single file, spacing tight enough for control, loose enough to limit damage if something went wrong. No one spoke. The only sound was gear shifting and boots pressing into dust that hid more than it revealed. They were halfway to the first compound when the radio cracked alive. "Stop." The voice was calm, flat, northern English. No urgency, no tension, just certainty. Kowalski froze immediately, hand up, the column locked behind him. 16 men, perfectly still, every instinct pushing them forward, every bit of training forcing them to hold. Left side of the track, the voice continued. 12 meters ahead, pressure plate. You're inside the secondary trigger radius. Don't move. Kowalski looked at the ground. Nothing. No wires, no disturbed soil, no sign of anything except the same dust they had already crossed. "Who is this?" he asked. A pause, measured, not uncertain. "Someone who can see it." For the next 38 minutes, 16 Marines stood motionless in open ground, guided by a voice they couldn't locate. The man described what they couldn't detect. A second device to the right. Offset, linked, safe angles to shift weight without triggering pressure. Updates on the disposal team's movement as they closed in. Every instruction precise. No wasted words. The engineers arrived and confirmed both devices. A daisy chain setup, enough to kill the lead element instantly. Kowalski scanned the area again. Fields, low walls, distant trees. Nothing moved. Nobody was there. They completed the mission anyway, cleared the compounds, found ammunition, explosives, enough material to build multiple devices like the one they had nearly walked into. On paper, it was a clean operation. That night, Kowalski wrote his report. At the bottom, he added one line. Unidentified call sign provided IED location during patrol. 2 devices confirmed. Request identification. The reply came the next morning. Request denied. No explanation, no follow-up. Just a quiet refusal that made the question more important than the answer. Tanner read it over his shoulder and shook his head. "I don't know what that guy is," he said quietly, "but he just saved 16 lives from a hole we walked straight into." Nobody disagreed. 4 days later, the voice came back. And this time, they saw him. 4 days later, the voice returned in daylight, cutting through the radio with the same calm certainty that had already stopped 16 Marines from walking into a kill zone they never saw. Kowalski's platoon had been holding a blocking position on the eastern edge of the district for over 2 hours, watching a thin tree line that ran parallel to the river while another unit cleared compounds to the south. It was the kind of mission that sounded simple on paper: hold, observe, report, but never stayed simple once you were inside it, waiting for something you could not yet see. 7 men moving north through the tree line, 300 meters east of you, armed. They haven't seen you. Kowalski lifted his binoculars immediately. At first there was nothing, just shadow, dust, heat distortion, but then the shapes began to separate from the background. 7 figures moving low and controlled, weapons carried ready, not slung, not relaxed. This was movement with intent. "Confirmed," Kowalski said. "They'll break from cover in 40 seconds at the northern end. You've got a gap. Move your eastern team 20 meters right." There was no hesitation. Kowalski signaled, and his team shifted position, boots pressing into dry earth that gave nothing away. The timing felt too precise to question, and yet too accurate to ignore. 40 seconds later, exactly where the voice had predicted, the fighters broke from the tree line into open ground. The Marines were already waiting. The engagement was over in less than 3 minutes. No chaos, no confusion, just a short, controlled exchange that ended as quickly as it began. When it was done, the silence that followed felt heavier than the contact itself, like the ground had already decided the outcome before anyone had moved. Kowalski lowered his binoculars slowly and started scanning everything except the obvious. Not the tree line, not the bodies, the terrain itself. Every fold of ground, every shadow line, every place a human could disappear into and remain unseen. Nothing moved. Then the voice came from behind him. "That's two." Kowalski turned immediately. 15 meters back, in a shallow depression he had already crossed and dismissed as empty, two figures were rising from the earth. Not approaching, not stepping in. Rising, like they had been part of the ground and were simply deciding to separate from it. For a second his brain refused to process what he was seeing. He knew that patch of terrain. He had looked directly at it during movement. It had been nothing, flat, useless, irrelevant. Now it contained two men. The first stood fully, dust falling from his uniform in thin layers. His camouflage was British pattern, but heavily modified, irregular additions that broke the outline of his body in unnatural ways, making focus slip away from him if you looked too long. Everything about him was coated in the same fine dust, as if he had been there long enough for the ground to claim him. The second man remained slightly lower, already scanning, already working. His attention moved constantly, never resting, never drifting. He wasn't observing the scene, he was processing it. The first man looked directly at Kowalski. "Staff Sergeant Kowalski." Not a question. "Yeah," Kowalski replied, still trying to align what he was seeing with what should be possible. "How long have you been there?" The man glanced briefly at the depression behind him. "Since before you arrived." Kowalski looked back at the exact spot again. "I looked right at that." "Yes." No emphasis, no pride, just confirmation. Up close, he looked younger than expected. Late 20s, lean, stripped of anything unnecessary. His rifle hung low across his chest, longer than standard issue, bolt action, built for distance rather than volume. Everything about him suggested patience over aggression. Kowalski asked for unit identification. "Not something you need to worry about." "What are you doing out here?" "Watching." "How long?" "Long enough." Each answer was complete in itself. Nothing was left open, nothing required expansion. It wasn't evasive, it was final. The second man, the spotter, never spoke. He shifted slightly, scanning the tree line, then the open field, then the Marines, then back out again. His movement was continuous, quiet, mechanical in its discipline. When the moment ended, the spotter stepped forward and shook hands with two Marines on the flank. Quick, firm, no words exchanged. The first man moved toward Kowalski last. They shook hands. His grip was steady, controlled, without pressure or display. Just contact, nothing more, nothing less. "Hold your eastern side tighter," he said. "They'll try that route again." Kowalski nodded. Understood. The man gave a slight nod in return and turned away immediately, as if the conversation had already reached its natural end. The spotter followed. Within seconds, they were at the tree line. Within half a minute, they were gone. Not fast, not dramatic, just gone in a way that left no direction to follow. Kowalski kept watching anyway. Beside him, Private Hernandez exhaled slowly. What the hell was that? Kowalski didn't take his eyes off the empty terrain. SAS, he said. Hernandez shook his head slightly. Yeah, but what? Kowalski paused for a moment. I don't think there's a word for it. They reset positions and continued the mission, but something had changed. The district no longer felt random. It felt observed, like there was another layer operating just beyond perception, shaping movement without ever revealing itself. Over the following days, a pattern began to emerge. No coordination, no official link, no visible connection. The voice would appear before a patrol, and the patrol would change. A route that looked dangerous would suddenly go quiet. A direction Kowalski intended to take would receive a short, quiet correction over the radio. I'd go the other way. And he always did. And it was always right. What began to settle in wasn't just the accuracy, it was the logic behind it. The man wasn't eliminating threats, he was reshaping space itself, making certain paths too dangerous to use and others too costly to attempt until behavior changed on its own. It wasn't control through force, it was control through absence. And in that absence, nothing happening wasn't failure. It was the outcome. That was the part Kowalski had never been trained to measure. The operation came in just before dawn, when the district was still half asleep and the air carried that brief, thin cold that never lasted long in Helmand. Intelligence had identified a command node operating from a cluster of 3 compounds on the northern edge of the district. The same compounds that had been watched, mapped, and silently controlled for weeks by the unknown British element moving through the ground like it belonged to them more than the people living on it. This time, the mission wasn't observation. It was removal. Kowalski's platoon was assigned the southern approach. A second marine element would cover the east. The high ground to the northwest was already occupied by the British Overwatch team, Mercer and his spotter, though nobody in Kowalski's chain of command ever officially said their names. They didn't appear on coordination sheets. They didn't exist in planning language. They were simply already in position. The approach began at 0400. No lights, no noise, just movement through terrain that didn't forgive mistakes. Dust stuck immediately to sweat. Night vision flattened distance into unnatural shades, and every sound felt larger than it should have been. Kowalski moved at the front of his element, reading the ground more than the map at this point, trusting spacing, timing, instinct. Then the radio clicked. Hold. Same voice. Same calm, no introduction. Kowalski stopped immediately. The entire column froze behind him without question. Guard rotation on the northern wall changed. 2 minutes early. You're still 40 meters short of contact distance. Kowalski raised his optics slowly. The compound ahead was quiet, silhouettes of mud walls and shadowed corners barely visible in the pre-dawn haze. Confirm? He asked. A pause. Confirmed. They waited. The kind of waiting that wasn't passive. It was controlled tension, breathing measured, weapons steady, eyes locked on a point that could turn into a fight without warning. 40 seconds passed, then another. From somewhere far above them, unseen, the British Overwatch position held everything in place. Mercer's team wasn't part of the movement on the ground, but they were shaping it, watching angles no one else could see, measuring distances no one else could verify. Then the voice returned. Now. Kowalski moved. The platoon closed the remaining distance fast, pressing against the southern wall just as the new guard rotation stepped into position on the far side. The timing was tight, too tight to be comfortable. One mistake, one turn of the head, and the entire operation would have collapsed into contact before it was ready. But nothing happened. The guard didn't look down, didn't shift, didn't notice. Kowalski pressed against the mud brick, heart steady but aware of exactly how close they were sitting to failure. 7 meters above him, a silhouette moved along the wall, unaware of what was directly beneath him. Then Kowalski heard it again. Not over comms this time, but in his ear through the radio net. Hold position. It wasn't directed at him. It wasn't necessary. It was confirmation that someone else was still watching the geometry of the moment from somewhere beyond visual range. Above them, at 840 meters, Mercer was lying still. Completely still. His position wasn't comfortable. It wasn't meant to be. A shallow depression cut into the slope, barely enough to break outline from distance, exposed enough that anything less than perfect discipline would turn it into a death sentence. But Mercer wasn't adjusting. He was already locked. His rifle was steady, angled slightly down through the terrain toward the compound wall. L115A3, bolt-action, long-range precision platform, built for distances where time mattered more than speed. His eye stayed in the scope without break. Beside him, Cooper didn't speak. He didn't need to. His job wasn't commentary, it was confirmation. Wind, distance, movement patterns, every variable already accounted for and continuously updated without noise. Distance, Cooper finally asked, barely audible. 840, Mercer replied. Below them, the target area was active but unaware. A guard pacing, another adjusting position. Marines pressed against the wall, waiting for the final phase of movement that would turn observation into action. Mercer didn't move. Not once. 4 minutes passed like that. Not waiting. Holding. There was a difference. Every second, the calculation stayed live. Wind shifting slightly across the valley. Heat rising from the ground even before the sun fully appeared. Micro-adjustments that never left his mind. The rifle never left his shoulder line. His breathing never broke rhythm. Below, Kowalski could feel it without knowing it, something holding the entire moment in suspension. Not chance, not luck, structure. Then Cooper spoke again. Now. Mercer didn't answer. He exhaled once. The shot didn't sound like much at that distance. It never did. Just a sharp, distant crack that disappeared almost immediately into terrain and air. 740 meters below, a guard on the wall dropped instantly, without confusion, without delay, as if the moment had simply ended him before he had time to react to it. No alarm followed, no immediate chaos, just absence where presence had been. Kowalski saw it happen and didn't register it as sound or motion first. He registered it as timing. Too clean, too exact. He looked up instinctively, though there was nothing to see at that distance, just terrain, ridgeline, empty ground. But it wasn't empty. Above them, Mercer stayed in position for a full second longer, still looking through the scope, confirming what had already been completed before anyone else had time to interpret it. Then he finally shifted, just slightly, breaking contact with the rifle and easing back from the line of exposure. Below, the wall remained quiet. The operation continued. No alarm, no immediate escalation. Just controlled movement from Marines who had already adapted to the idea that something above them had just removed a problem they were never going to see clearly. The breach went in seconds later. Clean entry, controlled movement through the southern compound. The node collapsed faster than expected. Communication disrupted, leadership isolated, resistance broken before it could fully organize. By the time extraction began, the district had already shifted again. Not through force alone, but through removal of possibility. Kowalski watched the high ground once during withdrawal. He couldn't see anything, he never could. But he knew exactly where Mercer had been, and more importantly, he knew he was already gone. The extraction was quiet in a way that felt wrong for a place that had been so loud in its violence only hours earlier. No pursuit, no final burst of contact, no last-minute chaos. Just Marines moving back through ground that now felt strangely empty, as if the district had already accepted what had happened and decided not to resist the departure. Kowalski noticed it first in the absence of pressure. The same routes that had felt dangerous on the way in no longer carried that tension. Not safe, nothing in that place was ever safe, but neutral in a way he didn't trust. It was as if someone had already walked the terrain ahead of them and removed everything that might react badly to their presence. He looked once toward the northern ridge where Mercer's team had been. There was nothing visible, no movement, no sign, just broken lines of rock and dust catching the early light. He knew they were gone because that was always how it ended. No withdrawal, no signal, no confirmation. Just absence. Back at the patrol base, reports began immediately. Standard procedure, timeline, contact, outcomes, enemy assessment. Everything structured, everything measurable. But Kowalski found himself hesitating when he reached the section about external support. There was no category for what had happened. No slot in the form for a voice that appeared before contact, or a man who could lie in ground that had already been visually cleared and still remain unseen. He wrote it anyway, in the only way the system allowed. Unidentified allied element provided real-time intelligence and overwatch during operation. Multiple engagements influenced, no visual confirmation of unit location. He stopped there, because anything beyond that sounded less like reporting and more like trying to describe something that refused to stay inside language. The response came back the next morning. Short, final, no record of such unit operating in sector. That should have closed it. It didn't. Because over the following weeks, the pattern continued even without direct contact. Patrols moving through the northern routes found fewer disruptions. Areas that had previously required constant adjustment now behaved differently, as if the pressure that once existed there had been redistributed somewhere else, not removed, managed. And occasionally, just occasionally, the radio would crack open with a familiar voice before movement began. Not always, not predictably. Just enough to confirm that whatever had been there hadn't disappeared. It had simply stepped further back into the environment. I'd go the other way. No explanation, no context, just direction. And it was always correct. Kowalski stopped trying to fit it into normal categories. At first he had looked for structure, who they were, what unit they belonged to, how they were coordinated. Then he shifted to tactics, how they achieved what they achieved, what systems made it possible. Eventually he stopped asking both, because none of those questions led anywhere useful. What remained was simpler and harder to explain. They didn't operate in the battle space the way everyone else did. They operated in the space before it, in probabilities, in patterns, in the moment before movement became action. And that was where they stayed. Back home, long after the deployment ended, Kowalski tried to describe it once to his wife. Not names, not details, just the feeling. The way the ground had sometimes felt like it was already decided before they arrived. the way silence had sometimes carried more information than radio traffic, the way a man could be physically present in a place and still not exist within it until he chose to. She listened, then asked the only question that mattered. What was he like? Kowalski thought for a long moment. Not about rank or skill or anything that could be measured. Those were obvious. It wasn't what he did, he said finally. It was that nothing around him ever became uncertain. He paused again. He didn't react to the ground, Kowalski added. The ground reacted to him. He never tried to explain it again. Because some things, once seen clearly, don't get smaller when you describe them. They just lose accuracy. Months later, when the story faded from official memory and returned to the places it was always going to live, in fragments, in whispers, in second-hand retellings, Kowalski found himself thinking less about the shot, less about the radio voice, and more about the stillness. 9 hours in a depression in the ground. 40 minutes holding a patrol in place without being seen. A sector that changed behavior without ever acknowledging why. That was the part nobody wrote down properly. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't look like anything happening at all. And that, in the end, was the point. Mercer wasn't remembered as a man who appeared at the right moment. He was remembered as the reason certain moments never fully formed in the first place. Not a presence, not even a ghost in the usual sense. More like a correction in the system of movement itself. Something that made the dangerous paths empty, not by force, but by making them too expensive to exist. And when Kowalski finally stopped trying to categorize it, he realized the simplest truth of all. They had never been following the man in the ground. They had been moving through a space that had already been rewritten before they arrived. And somewhere beyond the ridgelines, beyond the compounds, beyond the maps and reports and after-action summaries, there were still teams like that. Quiet, unseen, already there before anyone thought to look. The ghosts didn't disappear. They just stopped being noticed, because nothing they did ever needed to be seen twice.